Hello everyone, my name is Pankaj Kumar Sahu, roll number 460, a course BCom Honors. Today I am here to discuss the topic debit note and credit note under GST, which deals with the section 34. So guys, section 34 defines the credit note and debit note, and credit note is defined under the section 34 subsection 1. As per section 34(1), where a tax invoice has been issued for supply of any goods and services or both, and the tax charge in the tax invoice is found to exist the tax payable in respect of such supply, or where the goods are returned by the recipient, then the supplier may issue a credit note to the receiver of such goods. Such as just because a tax charge in the invoice is found to exist, because the tax payable is less than the tax charge on the invoice, and the goods are returned by the recipient to the supplier, then the supplier may issue a credit note to the recipient. Otherwise it will not issue to him. Yeah. Now here are some cases where a supplier can issue a credit note to the recipient under GST. So the first one is original tax invoice has been issued and taxable value in the invoice is exceeds the actual tax value as we defined it earlier in the definition. Okay. The second one is original tax invoice has been issued and the tax charge in the invoice is exceeds the actual tax to be paid. Okay. The third one is recipients returns the good to the supplier. If recipient returns the good to the supplier, then the supplier may issue a credit note to the recipients. Okay. The fourth and the last one is where goods and services are found to be deficient. In case the recipient founds the goods and services is not up to the mark of its quality, then he can return the good to the supplier, and the supplier will issue the credit note against the returned goods to him. Thank you. So guys, every credit note has to be declared in a GST return. If any supplier has issued a credit note on behalf of the recipient, then he must or he will be declare this credit note in his GST return, as we know that any registered person who issue a credit note in relation to a supply of goods or services or both shall declare the detail of such credit note in the return of the month during which such credit note has been issued, but not later than by the 30th September of the following the end of the year in which such supply was made, the date of filing of the relevant annual return, whichever is earlier. In the case of credit note, we can declare the credit note in GST return by the 30th September of the following the end of the year, or the date of filing the relevant annual return, whichever is earlier. So guys, what will be the impact of credit note on taxability? There are some rules and regulations specified under the GST Act. According to the provisions of the GST Act, the adjustment of the tax liability may be prescribed. Okay. The tax liability shall be adjusted in such a manner as may be prescribed under the rules and provisions of the GST Act. Okay. And however, no reduction in output tax liability of the supplier shall be permitted if the incident of tax and interest on such supply has been passed on to any other person. If the supplier pass the tax burden and interest of the supply on to the another person, then there is no reduction in the tax liability. If the tax incident and the tax burden is borne by the supplier, then there may be a chance to reduce the tax liability of the supplier under the provisions of GST. So now we going to discuss the debit note which defines under the section 34 subsection 3. As per section 34 subsection 3, where a tax invoice has been issued for supply of any goods and services or both, the tax charge in the tax invoice is found to be less than tax payable in respect of such supply. The registered person who has supplied such goods or services shall issue recipients a debit note containing particular as may be prescribed under the section 34 subsection 3. So guys, the debit note can be issued by a supplier to the recipient in only the two cases where the tax charge in the tax invoice is found to be less than tax payable, or the next one is when the supplier shall be recipient of, okay, so issue a debit note. So guys, here are some cases where a debit note is issued under the GST. So cases where a debit note can be issued by the supplier are given below. There are two cases where a supplier can issue a debit note to the recipient. The first one is original tax invoice has been issued. If the supplier has been issued original tax invoice to the recipient and the taxable value in the invoice is less than the actual tax value, if the tax payable is less than the actual tax value, then the supplier may issue a debit note to the recipient. And the second one is original tax invoice has been issued. If the supplier has been issued original tax invoice to the recipient and the tax charge in the invoice is less than the actual tax to be paid, if the tax charged by the supplier from the recipient is less than the actual tax paid, then the supplier may issue a debit note to the recipient. There are only two cases where a supplier can issue a debit note, and otherwise there are except these two cases, the supplier may not issue a debit note to the recipient. So the debit note needs to be declared in the GST return by the supplier. So the supplier or maybe it can be any registered person who issue a debit note in relation to supply of goods or services or both shall declare the detail of such debit note in the return for the month during which such debit note has been issued. The debit note shall include supplementary invoice also. Here, the supplementary invoices are the original invoice which is issued by the supplier at the time of supplying the goods to the recipients, and the date should not be the declaration of the details of the debit note in return should be the month in which it has been issued to the recipient. It should not go beyond that date. Uh, so guys, here are some details to be covered under a debit or credit note. These are some details which needs to be in a credit and debit note to considered a proper full-fledged document. If any of these details is missing from the debit or credit note, it will not considered as a full-fledged or a legal document. So the first details is that name, address, and GST number of the supplier. It should be mentioned in the top in the document with the name, address, and GST number of the supplier. And the second one is nature of the document. The nature, whether it is a debit note, whether it is a credit note, it should be mentioned properly on the above of the document at the head of the document, whether and the nature of the document. Okay, the third one is a consecutive serial number containing only alphabets, numerical, and unique for a financial year. There should be a number which is a combination of alphabets and numericals uh, to authorize or to verify a document. It should be a unique should be a unique code for every financial year. We should be vary from year to year. Okay. The fourth one is date of issue of such document. The date of issue of such document needs to be mentioned in the document on the above top of the document. The next one is name, address of the recipient and address of the delivery along with the name of the state and its code if such recipient is unregistered. If the recipient is registered, then the name and address of the recipients and address of the delivery is sufficient. But if the recipient is unregistered, then the name of the state and its code with the address and name of the recipient is compulsory to be mentioned there in the document on the right hand side of the supplier's detail. Okay. The next one is serial number and date if the corresponding tax invoice as case may be bill of supply. And the next one is the serial number and date should be mentioned in the tax invoice. Should be mentioned in the debit note like this. Okay. And and the next one is the taxable value of goods and services, rate of tax and the amount of tax created as the case may be debited to the recipient. The taxable value of a goods, the amount on which the tax is to be calculated, and the rate of tax, the rate of tax which is 18, 12, whatever the rate should be mentioned there, and according to which the rate the tax to be calculated, and the amount of tax created, it should be mentioned there. Okay. And the last and very important point is that the signature or digital signature of the supplier or his authorized representative. The signature and the digital signature is very important thing to show in the debit or credit note. It specifies that the document is a legal and proper authorized. If if the signature and digital signature of the supplier is missing from the debit or credit note, then it will not be considered as a legal or a full-fledged document. So guys, earlier I have discussed that the details need to be mentioned under a debit note and credit note. So here is a format of the format, or let's say a debit note of a Alpha Computer Limited ka, and the address is mentioned here with the details of the supplier. Okay, and the nature of the document is mentioned here on the top of the document, which is debit note, and the date should be mentioned here, and invoice and invoice date and invoice number is mentioned on the top of the document, and the recipient's details are mentioned on the right side of the supplier's details. And here's the below the details of the supplier, the category of the product and the service name is mentioned here: HP Bluetooth speaker 400, and the unit price is mentioned, and the tax rate is mentioned here on the unit price, and which is CGST and SGST is combining the GST. And here CGST referred to the central goods and services tax, and SGST referred as state goods and services tax, and the total amount is the inclusion of the CGST, SGST and unit price. And here the shipping and packing charge 18%, which is 278, and the total amount needs to be paid by the recipient is 7478.46. And here on the left hand side below, at the footnote at the below of the document, the authorized signature and the authorized digital signature of the supplier need to be mentioned here. If this is missing in the document, it will not be considered as a full-fledged document, and if that all these details are mentioned here, the document will look like a very legal and authorized document, and every details has its own importance, and every in this document everything is should be mentioned here, so it can be considered as a full-fledged and proper legalized document. So guys, earlier I have discussed the details need to be mentioned in a debit and credit note and the performer and format of a debit note. Now I am going to describe the format of a credit note. It is same as debit note, but there is one change only. They should be mentioned the category and the nature of a document. Here it is credit note 1 mentioned in the document, and the date should be mentioned here. All is the same as the earlier I have described in the debit note. The amount CGST calculated, SGST calculated, and the total amount the paying charges is included, and the authorized signature should be mentioned below the documents. And there is a there is a address of the supplier, and the recipient's address should be mentioned here. It is same as earlier I have described in the debit note, nothing else in the next. Let's move to the next slide. So guys, earlier I have discussed the section 34, under which I have discussed about the debit note and credit note, and the section 34 subsection 1 defines the debit note and the cases where debit note can be issued by the supplier to the recipient. And then after that I discussed the credit note under the section 34 subsection 3, and the cases where debit credit note can be issued by supplier to the recipient of the goods. And after that I have discussed that the details, and the details should be mentioned in the debit note and credit note under the GST. And then I discussed the performa and format of debit note and credit note. Now I am going to discuss about the prohibition of unauthorized collection of tax under section 32. A person who is not a registered person shall not collect tax in respect of any supply of goods or services, or both, any amount by way of tax collected under the GST Act. Moreover, registered persons shall collect tax only with provisions of CGST Act and rules made thereunder. So guys, there is no one who can collect the tax with any unauthorized way. The only authorized way to collect the tax is the is the mentioned in the Constitution of India and the CGST Act. CGST Act and the Constitution of India gives power to some authority to collect that tax from the supplier or the people of the India. And there are some rate of tax and nature of supply which is not determinable. So there are some category of goods and goods and services where we cannot specify or determine the rate of tax and nature of supply. Then the following provision will be applicable to that. So the first provisions to Rule 50 of CGST Rule 2070 prescribed that where at the time of receipt of advance the rate of tax nature of supply is not determinable, and following shall be applicable. When there is a category of goods which is not defined in any of the categories and not belongs to any category, then the rate of tax which will be applicable is 18% to all the goods and all the services of both, which is not categorized in any of the following categories. So where the nature of supply is not so here comes a important question: where the supply and nature of supply is not determinable, then the supply shall be treated as interstate supply. Okay, so here we have discussed the authorized authority by whom the tax would be collected. The tax is collected by like two or three authorities, like the one is central government, and then state government, and the local authorities, which comprise the municipal corporation, panchayat, etc. These are the legal authority. These have a legal authorities to collect tax from us. So guys, thanks for watching the video.